Frankie, do you believe in God's existence?
Well, I don't,
You're
actually.
an atheist? Do you believe in God's existence?
Yes, sir, but I have questions about this too.
Like, I believe in God because I was born in a family that believes in Him, and I was raised praying. But I have a lot of questions myself.
Do you think God exists?
I believe in a higher power.
I don't know if it's God at the end or which God it might be, you know, because there's many of them. So no one really knows which one it might be. So you got to keep your mind open to everything.
Do you believe the Bible?
Some of it yes, some of it no.
To me, it's irrelevant what the Bible says because I don't invest in it the same belief and the same perception that it carries a level of truth. While I do admit there's great passages in it, provide some good thoughts for wisdom and philosophy, but I don't find that to be the true word of any post-existential being because I don't believe in one.
Hello, Journey, and Happy New Year. I want to say welcome to everybody here at our Apopka campus and those that are joining us live stream, worshiping with us from all around the world. Thank you for being a part of that. I just love the beginning of a new year because there's so many possibilities and so many new experiences lay ahead. And for church goers, everybody here has perfect attendance for the year. You have perfect attendance. Nobody here has missed a weekend of worship this year, and that makes us all feel like winners, doesn't it? It's like doing the first workout of the new year, and you feel like this year is going to be different. This is the year that I'm going to stick with it. And I really do hope you stick with us over the next few weeks as we launch into, I believe, a very important series titled Unbelievable. We live in a time of increasing polarization and division. Would you agree with that? There is a great and ever-widening gulf between what is popularly known as liberalism on one side and conservatism on the other side, and each side demands that you not only disagree, but disdain, discredit, and wholly denounce the other side as at best crazy or at worst evil. And every day, the inflammatory rhetoric and the incendiary outrage at the other side seems to be escalating. This is particularly true when matters of faith are discussed and at stake. I just want to say up front as we begin this series, we want to be a church where every person is respected and every question can get raised and dealt with in a real, open, and honest fashion. Our model for doing this is Jesus. This might surprise you, but in the gospel records of the life of Jesus, sometimes people came to him who didn't understand who he was or had serious doubts about his claims, and sometimes they interrupted his teaching to ask a question that was important to them, and then there were others who came who had no intention of believing in Jesus. They came only to accuse and attack him, but regardless of their motives or their political or religious views, everybody was welcome to come to Jesus. One time a man came to Jesus and he needed some help with a deeply troubled son. And he says to Jesus, I believe in you, but then I don't. Can you help me with my unbelief? Another time, one of Jesus' closest disciples named Thomas had doubts about Jesus' own resurrection. And at the very end of the gospel, according to Matthew, after the resurrected Jesus has appeared to his remaining disciples, it says this surprising statement. They worshiped him, but some doubted. Can you worship and doubt? And Jesus never said to anybody, well, you doubted me, so I'm done with you. Jesus dealt with people with great compassion and honesty and directness and respect. And we want to be that way as his followers. So over the next several weeks, we're going to look at some questions folks have been asking for a long time, like, can you have faith and still have doubts? Why does a good God allow so much suffering? Can you believe in God and science? Did the Jesus we read about in the Bible even really exist? How can there be just one right belief system, and aren't all religions basically saying the same thing? And if they're not, does being a Christian mean you're hostile or arrogant toward other faiths? And why are so many church members jerks? And I particularly look forward to that message. Today I want to lay a foundation for all of this series by asking a really basic question. The question is this: is faith inherently irrational? Is faith inherently irrational? Meaning, is it possible to really believe deeply in reason and logic and learning and embrace faith in an unseen, miraculous, supernatural God? Aren't those two things, faith and reason, inherently opposing ideas? So I want to start by looking at some really common ideas about faith that I think are actually misconceptions that get in people's way when it comes to believing in God, and I want us to look at what that means for your life and my life. I read an article just a few days ago about some popular myths that were debunked during the last decade, because we're not only starting a new year, you understand, we're starting a new decade. And so they said, here are some things over the last 10 years that they thought were true, but they're no longer true, such as margarine is not healthier for you than butter. I could have told them that. That Mars is not a dry and barren planet, that Amelia Earhart's disappearance is still a mystery, that IQ tests are not the best way to measure intelligence, and that girls are not inherently bad at math. Well, none of those things sound too shocking to me. But apparently they made the list of the supposed facts that turned out to be fake. And I think a similar filter should be applied to our discussion about faith. And that's what I want to do today. Before we start, I want to credit the sermons and books of Tim Keller and John Ortberg and Andy Stanley and Justin Brierley and Sir John Lennox, as well as many others that I've drawn on for content in this message and really this entire series, because it's no secret to you probably, but I'm not that smart. But I read a lot of smart people, and I'm passing along some of the best content that has helped me make better sense of these weighty topics, and maybe it can help you too. So here we go. Misconception number 1. Faith actually means believing good things for no good reason. The great American philosopher Archie Bunker once said, faith is something that you believe that nobody in his right mind would believe. The famous novelist Mark Twain once said, faith is believing what you know ain't so. This misconception is quite widespread. A Harvard professor named Steven Pinker put it like this: universities are about reason, pure and simple. Faith, believing something without good reasons to do so, has no place in anything but a religious institution. Some writers are much more harsh in their view of faith. Sam Harris is a widely read and quoted atheist who has said, we have names for people who have many beliefs for which there are no rational justification. When their beliefs are extremely common, we call them religious. Otherwise, they're likely to be called mad, psychotic, or delusional. While religious people, he says, are not generally mad, their core beliefs absolutely are. And I have found the main idea behind this definition of faith means that people believe what the authorities in their life tell them to believe, regardless of the evidence, whereas they would say reason means believing what the evidence tells you, regardless of what the authorities in your life tell you. And that sounds very enlightened. It sounds very intellectual, until you realize that for the first 3 centuries of its existence, the Christian faith spread and grew remarkably in spite of the fact that no authorities were behind it. Quite the contrary, the authorities were actually after it. It was often illegal in the Roman Empire through those early centuries to become a Christian, and sometimes that was the grounds of persecution or even execution. And that's the context of almost every letter to churches or Christian individuals written in the New Testament. In other words, the church grew despite the authorities being opposed to it, and at an unprecedented rate. Historians tell us the early church grew from around 1,000 Christians in AD 40, about 10 years after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, to maybe 10,000 by the year 100 AD, 60 years later, to maybe 200,000 by AD 200, and then a century later, to as many as 5 or 6 million. That is staggering growth. Andy Stanley writes, how did a religion birthed in the armpit of the Roman Empire, whose leader had been rejected by his own people and crucified as a wannabe king by Rome, survive in the face of overwhelming resistance? How is it that this same upstart religion would eventually be embraced by the very empire that sought to extinguish it? Sandwiched between the Jewish temple and the Roman Empire, the Jesus movement, he writes, should have been buried right alongside its founder, but it wasn't. At this very moment, he writes, Christians from all over the world are visiting the ruins of the Roman Forum, while 1,500 miles east of Rome, tourists are snapping pictures of the Temple Mount. Rome is adorned with crosses, and Jerusalem is filled with Christian tourists. How did that happen? Well, clearly it wasn't because there were authorities who said you have to believe this stuff. Listen carefully. Christian faith did not grow because the authorities were behind it. Christianity grew because there was an authority behind it, and that authority was the gospel that resurrected Jesus. Jesus said to his disciples after his resurrection, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. How much authority did Jesus claim for himself? All. If someone says they have all authority, they're the only authority to whom one need to appeal. That's a bold claim. And where did he claim to have all of this authority? In heaven and on earth. That's a big territory. But it was only the resurrection of Jesus that gave birth to the proclamation that people from all nations should become disciples of Jesus. The rest of the statement from the Gospel of Matthew reads like this: all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them everything I have commanded you. And we get a little glimpse of how the earliest Christians did that in the New Testament book of Acts. For instance, when Paul visited the city of Athens, he understood that Athens was historically the center of Greek philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle were the pinnacle of human thought and logic and reason. Maybe you heard about those three guys in a philosophy class because nobody doubts their existence. We're told by Luke, the author of Acts, so Paul reasoned. And I think that word is chosen deliberately, not just preached, but reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace. And here we see Paul is now stepping out of what would be considered the realm of religious instruction in a religious institution, and he's now in the free-flowing marketplace of ideas. And he did this day by day with those who happened to be there. And a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him, and some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? Epicureans and Stoics were the recognized intellectuals of that day. They both held what higher education would call endowed chairs in Athens. Epicureans were among the very early believers of a common notion in our day, which is the claim that physical reality is all there is. In other words, we're just molecules in motion following the patterns of natural law. Or as the atheist British philosopher Bertrand Russell more succinctly put it, that we're an accidental allocation of atoms. That's all we are. In fact, one of the ancient Epicurean sayings went like this: nothing to fear in God, there is no supernatural. Nothing to feel in death, there is no afterlife. Good pleasure can be attained, evil pain can be endured. That is what life is about. That's a very old and prominent idea in Athens over 2,000 years ago. And friends, this is the dominant view of today's new atheists. There were the Stoics. The Stoics gave preeminent place to reason and logic above emotion. They believed that self-mastery, the ability to order your emotions and your inner world, was the ultimate model for human flourishing. The point here is that Paul and many other believers in Jesus like Paul had conversations in the marketplace of ideas because the Christian understanding of how things are about the human condition did not grow by avoiding rational conversation on the basis of authority. It actually grew by inviting rational conversation, very often while being opposed by the authorities. Christianity's explanation of life, how did we get here? What's wrong with us? What's our purpose? Together with a community of unprecedented love that taught all of humanity was meant to be one together, that everybody is of equal worth, and there were actually solid grounds for that claim based on the resurrection of Jesus that's ushered in a new creation where virtues like humility and forgiveness and generosity are at its core, simply overwhelmed the ancient world in a way that all the money, authority, and power of Rome could not stop. John Ortberg points out it's worth noting that universities themselves, beginning with the very first ones in Paris, and about a century later with Oxford and Cambridge in Great Britain, were a Christian idea that grew out of monastic communities, which are guilds of scholars that wanted to love God. The motto of Oxford University in Great Britain to this day is, "The Lord is my light," taken from the Psalms and the Hebrew Scriptures. And then in America, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, along with every other Ivy League school were founded originally by Christians for the purpose of teaching everything Jesus commanded us about how to live. In fact, 92% of the first 130 colleges and universities founded in America came into existence by followers of Jesus who believed all human beings ought to be trained in logic and reason so that all human beings would be able to reflect and love the Lord their God with all their mind. So friends, let me tell you, whether you agree with it or not, faith was never understood by the people who engaged it to be opposed to reason, but to be tested by reason. Misconception number 2. No one can really know moral truth or spiritual knowledge, so agnosticism or skepticism is the best response or best posture. Often in our day, faith is relegated to tradition, preference, and opinion, but not knowledge. It's thought that you can know stuff about chemistry and you can know stuff about mathematics, but not when it comes to God or to morality. And what's behind this misconception is the idea that all religions say basically the same thing, and they simply deal in opinion, tradition, or preference. But one of the most important and frequently used words by biblical writers is this little word right here, knowledge. Everybody say that with me. Knowledge. And this is at the core of Jesus' mission. Jesus said this one time, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. It's not an accident, by the way, that the last half of that statement by Jesus, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free, that is written on more walls of more universities than any other statement ever made by another human being. Whether you think Jesus is right or wrong, friends, he claimed to know something. He didn't just walk around teaching little moral lessons and dispensing practical advice about how to live a happy life. He claimed to know that what is most real is God and God's kingdom, and therefore we can trust him. He said the good life is being loved by and alive to this God, that the good person is one who's thoroughly immersed in love for God and for other people, and that you and I can grow to become a good person by becoming a learner, a student, and a disciple of Jesus. Friends, this is not just tradition or opinion or preference. This is a body of Christian knowledge, and it has yet to be proven untrue. Jesus knew a well-lived life depends on sound knowledge about what matters most. So let's talk for a moment about what it means to actually know something. A couple of questions for you. Number 1, can you believe something and be wrong about it? Can you believe something and be wrong about it? Of course you can. My wife does it all the time. And she would say the same thing about me. And she would be very right. Of course you can believe something and be wrong about it. Here's the second question. Can you know something and be wrong about it? No, you can't. Not by the definition of knowledge. Knowledge is something different than feeling very, very certain about something at the top of my voice. To know means I am representing it. I'm thinking about it. I'm handling it. I am talking about something as it actually is for good reason, not just based on a lucky guess. That's what it means to know. And what counts as knowledge is highly contested in our day, because to have knowledge means to have authority, so it has become very politicized. We say to other people all the time, don't impose your opinions on me. We do not say, don't impose your knowledge on me. Why not? Because knowledge, reality, and truth will impose itself on me whether I want it to or whether I believe in it or not. Dallas Willard used to say, pain is what you experience when you bump into reality, because reality is just there, friends. We live in a day when people are often urged to consider life's most important issues. What's a good person? How do I become a good person? What is the purpose of my existence? As matters of opinion, preference, or tradition, but not things that an educated person could ever claim to know. For most of the history of the human race in the ancient world, including certainly the nation of Israel, people believed education began in the knowledge of God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, the Proverbs writer said. To people in the ancient world, the idea that education would not address knowledge about what matters most would have been perceived as a train wreck, which is pretty much what we see happening throughout our country over the last several decades, as the knowledge of God has been banished from more and more of our society. By contrast, like a light coming through the doom and gloom of despair, the biblical writers insist that what is being presented in the scriptures is knowledge. The Apostle Peter put it like this. He said, make every effort to add to your faith goodness, and to goodness what? Knowledge. Faith and knowledge, friends, are not opposed to one another. The gospel writer Luke said he carefully investigated his writings so that those of us who would read it may know the certainty of the things we have been taught about Jesus. This does not, as we will see, sanction arrogant attitudes, nor does it mean that Christians are untroubled by questions and doubts. We'll talk about that in detail next week. But Paul once put it like this. He said, now we know in part, we see through a glass darkly. I learned that there's a book written by a biologist named David Barash called Through a Glass Brightly, and the writer deliberately contrasts the title of his book with Paul's language here in 1 Corinthians. Barash is claiming that science now has shown us through a glass brightly what religion through a glass darkly could not show us. And what has science shown us? This is a direct quote from his book. The reality that life in general and our individual life in particular is inherently meaningless. But friends, if life is inherently meaningless, why go to the trouble of writing a book about it? I mean, what's the point? More than that, where is there any study in any of the sciences, in any article, that would present the meaningless of individual and cosmic life as a scientific finding? You can look, but you won't find it. The problem is, many people give to all statements by scientists the authority rightly due to science, simply because they're made by scientists. There's a little phrase about knowledge that your mom and my mom used to tell us that has a far deeper meaning. You know what your mom would say to you? You know better. You know better. You shouldn't have stolen that candy. You shouldn't have hit your little brother. You shouldn't have lied and said, I don't know who did it, when you know, because you're the one who did it. You know better. Your mom did not say to you, you believed better. You prefer better. No, what'd she say? You know better. And you know what? Your mom was right. You should call your mom, if that's possible, after this service and tell her, Mom, you were right. And she'll probably say, I know. Michael Cohen is a name some of you probably heard about in the news several months back for confessing to criminal activities while serving as a high-powered Manhattan attorney for many people in power. He was asked by an interviewer if he could go back to his younger self before he started down the path of wrongdoing, what would he say to his younger self? Now, putting aside questions of his sincerity or your political views about him, I think his answer is very revealing. Michael Cohen said if he could talk to his younger self, he would say, what were you thinking? You knew better. You knew better. In other words, it is possible for us to know something but deceive ourselves or play tricks with our minds to distract or forget in ways that enable us to do what we want to do as if we do not know what we really know. The Apostle Paul lived 2,000 years ago, but he was quite brilliant about the human mind and the nature of knowledge, and he put it like this. He said, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Paul said what every mom has spoken to every child, you know better. So this week, here's just one practical application of this message. Rather than worrying about your doubts, maybe you should ask yourself, where am I not living up to what I already know? Where might my future self come back to me and ask, you knew better? Was it in your finances? Is it in your family? Is it in your work? Is it with your words, with your sexuality? Search your heart. Where do you know better? Another practical note, if you're looking for a place to explore these questions in an interactive environment, a great next step for you is called Rooted. Rooted is the place where you can dig really deeply in a conversational way through a lot of the questions that we're talking about in this series. The Rooted kickoff is 7 o'clock here at the Apopka campus, 7 o'clock this Thursday night. Rooted is the best introduction to a life of following Jesus that we offer at Journey. And if you know somebody who's wrestling with some heavy questions about faith, you could pray for them and you could invite them to be part of it. One last misconception before we finish today. And this one is as prominent inside the church as it is outside. And misconception number 3 is Christianity is about being right. Now let me just say, being right is a good thing. I have always preferred to be right as opposed to being wrong. For one thing, it just helps you deal with reality better. But being right is not the best thing in life. It can actually be kind of a dangerous thing. When you were in school, let me ask you, did you ever sit next to the kid in class who was always right all the time? Some of you were that kid. It's like the bride who said when she married Mr. Right, she didn't realize his first name was Always, right? Really smart guy once said this. He said, it's extremely difficult to be right and not hurt anybody with it. It's extremely difficult to be right and not hurt anybody with it. You know, one of the amazing things about Jesus is he was always right, but he never hurt anybody with it. His words often cause pain, and sometimes deliberately so, but they were never the words of a puffed up, smart guy ego who belittled people with lower IQs. Jesus could be with children and slaves and beggars and lepers and the uneducated and the illiterate, and he never made them feel like they were on the slow bus. He never made them feel stupid. They didn't look like that to him. One of the compelling reasons that Christianity is true is that it understands the relationship between knowledge and love so profoundly. The first century church at Corinth was filled with people who suffer from the smartest guy in the room syndrome. And Paul wrote these words to the church. He said, we know that we all possess knowledge. That was kind of a saying in ancient Corinth because they loved knowledge. But look what he said. But knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. Wow, there's a world of knowledge in that statement right there. And then he says, but whoever loves God is known by God. There was once a dad who was a really, really smart guy, and he had a little 3-year-old boy at the time of this story. And that little guy didn't really care how smart his dad was at all. He was not impressed. And one day, this dad and little 3-year-old boy, they're in the grocery store, boy's in the cart, and they're shopping. And the little guy starts getting fussy, and then it escalates to whining, and then it goes to cranky, and then upset, and obnoxious, and angry, and he's just out of control, and he will not stop. And I just want to give a shout out to any parents of 3-year-olds, especially 3-year-old boys. You got your hands full. Our middle grandson is 3 years old, and my daughter calls him a three-nager. This is a picture of me and my 2 oldest grandsons. This is Christmas morning, so my daughter and her family, they stayed all night with us on Christmas Eve, and these boys got up early, and we were up with them, and we hadn't opened presents yet. We were just waiting on their mom and dad to get up, and this is on the couch in our living room. And this is Hampton, he's 5, he's the oldest, and this is Davis, he's 3. And I just got my arms around them both, and we sat there for several minutes, and we just talked, and we looked around the room, and we said why different things are on the Christmas tree, and we said, why do we have skylights? And it was the best time. I mean, it was so precious. And so at the end of the day, they're getting ready to go home, and I pulled these 2 aside. I said, let me tell you, boys, you know what the best part of my Christmas was? It was sitting on the couch this morning with you 2 boys. And Hampton is thoughtful and sensitive like his mother. And he gets tears in his eyes. He says, me too, Pappy. The 3-year-old Davis, he says, why? He said, why? He said, I thought opening presents was the best part. So, shout out to all parents of 3-year-olds. Back to the story, the obnoxious, cranky 3-year-old in the grocery cart. So this little kid is out of control, and his dad is whispering quietly, it's okay, Lucas. We'll be done soon, Lucas. You can handle this, Lucas. Easy now, Lucas. And a woman watching all this meltdown take place hears him, and she says, you're so patient with little Lucas. And the man said, ma'am, my son's name is Wendell. My name is Lucas. And here's a really smart guy who doesn't know what to do with an out-of-control 3-year-old. And so since he doesn't know what to do, you know what he did? He just started singing his son a song, kind of a goofy song with a made-up melody and made-up lyrics on the spot, kind of like Elf singing in the mall, you know. And he just said, I'm so glad you're my son. I'm grateful I get to be your dad. I love seeing your face every day. It makes me happy when I see you smile. I love it sometimes at night when you don't even know I come in and just look at you sleeping. I love dreaming of what you might one day be when you grow up. And I want you to know whatever happens, wherever you go, whatever you do, I will always love you. You will always be my son, and I will always be your dad. And you will never be alone. And suddenly little Wendell gets really quiet, and his eyes get really wide, and his face gets really calm, and his little heart gets really still. And he listens to that wonderful song all the way out to the car. And his daddy puts him in the car seat in the back, and he gets in the front to drive off. And little Wendell says, sing it to me again, Daddy, sing it to me again. Because you never get too old to hear that song. Richard Foster, who shared that story, says that's the song we were all born to hear, and no other song can take its place. Because in the end, God will not ask me how much I knew. He will ask me how much I loved. Friends, we were made to love. We know this. We know better. This is why we have congregations and campuses and church plants. We want little outposts so that people can know they are loved and so they can hear the song that they were made to hear. Now, next week we'll talk about questioning our faith and doubting our doubts. This is a very important message to follow up on this one. But this week, I want to say to you, Journey, go and sing the song, because we are not here to show everybody that we're right. We're here to make disciples of Jesus who love God, who love people, and who serve the world. Would you pray together with me? Thank you, God, that we can know that we are loved. I pray you'll help everybody listening to these words and everybody who may be wrestling with doubts and questions and fears and hopes and uncertainty and skepticism and cynicism and maybe even despair. I pray that you will add to our faith knowledge. Thank you that life is worthwhile. Thank you that we are loved. May you make that love flow through us. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.